The air inside the Ironvale Casino was filtered, climate-controlled, and smelled of the kind of wealth that didn't just buy things, but bought people. It was a subterranean vault of gold-leafed ceilings and obsidian tables hidden deep beneath the city's surface where the laws of the sun didn't apply. Maricel Cade moved through the shadows of the high-roller floor with the ghost of her former life in every step, the ramrod-straight spine of a prima ballerina, the light-footed grace of someone who had once lived on her toes. But tonight, her feet felt like lead. She was 26, her natural curls pulled back into a tight, professional bun, her amber eyes reflecting the spinning roulette wheels as she balanced a tray of crystal flutes. The debt for her father's spinal surgery was a living thing, a shadow that followed her from her morning physical therapy classes to her double shifts in the velvet uniform. It was a number that kept growing, a monster she had to feed with every hour of her life. She didn't mind the work, but she hated the silence of the Ironvale, the way the men at the tables looked at her as if she were just another piece of the furniture, as invisible as the air conditioning. Before we continue, like this video if you've ever felt invisible in a world that only sees credentials and titles. Share it with someone who needs to hear that courage doesn't require permission. And subscribe so you don't miss what happens when one temp worker sees the truth everyone else is paid to ignore. Now let's continue. At the center of the room sat Thatcher Rowe. He was the gravity that held Ironvale together, a man of steel-gray eyes and charcoal wool who didn't gamble because he already owned the house. He didn't speak. He observed. His presence was a pressure wave that kept even the loudest drunks in check. But tonight, the pressure was failing. Maricel approached the velvet-draped VIP table, where a tech mogul named Julian Vance was drowning a losing streak in $300 a glass scotch. His face was flushed, his movements erratic, the heavy gold watch on his wrist catching the dim light. More, Vance snapped, not looking at her, his hand waving dismissively. Maricel leaned in, her movements practiced and clinical. Of course, Mr. Vance. Allow me. As she reached to clear the empty glass, Vance's hand shot out. He didn't just grab her. He clamped down on her wrist with a desperate, drunken strength, his fingers digging into the delicate skin and the complex network of tendons that had once allowed her to flow across a stage. I said now, girl, he growled, pulling her toward him. The movement was sudden and violent. Maricel's arm twisted at an unnatural angle, the tray in her other hand tilting precariously. She tried to pull back, her ballerina's instinct for balance kicking in, but the grip was too tight. And then, it happened. A sharp, sickening crack echoed through the quiet lounge. It wasn't the sound of glass breaking, it was the sound of living wood snapping. The tray crashed to the floor, crystal flutes shattering into 1,000 diamonds against the obsidian tile. The room, usually a hum of shuffling cards and low whispers, fell into a vacuum of absolute silence. Maricel didn't scream. She gasped, a small, hollow sound of air escaping a punctured lung. She clutched her right arm to her chest, her face turning the color of ash as tears immediately flooded her amber eyes. It hurts, she whispered. It wasn't a performance. It wasn't a plea for a tip or a cry for attention. It was the raw, honest confession of a body that had reached its breaking point. She was speaking to herself, to the pain that felt like a white-hot needle driven into her carpal tunnel. But the words vibrated through the still air of the casino like a thunderclap. Vance let go, his face flickering from rage to a panicked, sober realization of what he had done. But before he could speak, a shadow moved. Thatcher Rowe, the man who hadn't stood up for a guest in 3 years, was on his feet. The scrape of his chair against the floor sounded like a blade being drawn. The crack had reached him, and as he began to walk toward the trembling waitress, the entire high-roller floor felt the temperature drop to 0. The Ice King of Ironvale was moving, and the world was about to find out exactly what happened when he heard someone break. Chapter 1. The neon pulse of Ironvale City never truly reached the depths of the underground casino, but Maricel Cade could feel its rhythm in the ache of her arches. At 2 a.m., the air in the lounge grew thick, with the scent of expensive tobacco and the electric hum of high-stakes desperation. For Maricel, this was the midnight shift, the grueling hours where the elite of Nevada played with sums that could have bought her 1,000 lifetimes of security. She moved through the room with a phantom elegance, her body remembering the geometry of the stage even as she carried a heavy silver tray. Every time she pivoted to avoid a drunken gambler or reached to clear an obsidian table, her muscles mimicked the ghost of a pirouette or an arabesque. Years of training at the academy had forged her into something resilient and lithe, but that dream had shattered alongside her father's spine. Now her grace was a commodity used to navigate a world of velvet ropes and cold steel. She had been the star of her class, the one they said would fly. But the accident had grounded her. When the medical bills began to pile up, surgeries, specialized physical therapy, and the relentless cost of the spinal equipment her father needed, Maricel had traded her pointe shoes for a service uniform. She didn't mourn the stage anymore. She didn't have the time. Her life was a series of calculations. How many shifts until the next installment? How many hours of sleep could she sacrifice to study her physical therapy textbooks? Tonight, the casino felt particularly claustrophobic. The high rollers were restless, the air charged with the arrival of Thatcher Rowe. Maricel kept her eyes down, her amber gaze fixed on the reflection of the gold-leafed ceiling in the crystal flute she carried. She was a shadow in a room full of blinding lights, a girl of warm brown skin and short natural curls who tried to remain as invisible as the oxygen. Her father was her why. Every jolt of pain in her lower back, every condescending comment from a guest, was filtered through the image of him sitting in his wheelchair, his eyes still holding that spark of pride whenever she walked through the door. She was studying to be the one who would eventually walk him across a room again. That goal was her anchor, the only thing that kept her upright when the midnight shift threatened to pull her under. As she approached the central tables, the temperature of the room seemed to drop. The men here didn't laugh. They bartered. Maricel adjusted her grip on the tray, her slim wrists straining under the weight of the vintage scotch. She felt the heavy gaze of the room's silent master, though she didn't dare look up. She was just a waitress, a cog in the massive, glittering machine of Ironvale. She had survived 100 nights like this, buried her pain in the rhythm of service, and prepared to face the next. But as she moved toward the high roller booth, she had no way of knowing that the grace she had cultivated to survive would be the very thing that finally broke her. Chapter 2. The high roller floor of the Ironvale Casino was an ecosystem built on the illusion of control. But tonight, Julian Vance was unraveling. He was a man who lived in the jagged peaks of high-frequency trading, and his losses at the baccarat table had turned his blood into a cocktail of adrenaline and expensive, bitter scotch. Maricel could feel the erratic energy radiating off him before she even reached the velvet-draped perimeter of his booth. It was a frequency she had learned to avoid during her years in the ballet academy, the sound of a performer who had lost the rhythm and was looking for someone to blame. She approached with the quiet, balanced gait that was her only remaining luxury. Her tray was loaded with the heavy lead crystal decanter and a single glass, a weight she carried with the precision of a dancer holding a partner's hand. She didn't look at Thatcher Rowe, though she felt his presence like a cold front at the center of the room. She focused entirely on the task, on the geometry of the table, on being the perfect invisible servant. "Your refill, Mr. Vance," she murmured, her voice a low, melodic contrast to the harsh clatter of chips. Vance didn't look up. His eyes were bloodshot, fixed on the cards that had just betrayed him. As Maricel reached forward to set the decanter down, her movements were fluid and professional. But as her hand retracted, Vance's arm shot out with the speed of a cornered animal. He didn't just grab her, he lunged, his fingers locking around her right wrist with a crushing, unrefined force. The tray wobbled. Maricel's breath hitched, her ballerina's instinct for stability fighting against the sudden, violent anchor on her arm. "Sir, please," she whispered, her amber eyes widening. "Your bad luck," Vance hissed, his grip tightening until his knuckles turned a ghostly white. He twisted her arm toward him, trying to pull her into his space, to make her the scapegoat for his failing night. He wasn't just holding her, he was squeezing, his thumb pressing into the delicate space between the radius and the ulna where the nerves were most exposed. Maricel tried to pull back, her body instinctively attempting a graceful retreat, but the leverage was all his. He jerked her arm upward at a sharp, unnatural angle. In that second, the world narrowed down to the sound of her own heartbeat and the structural integrity of her own body. Then came the crack. It was a sharp, dry sound, like a winter branch snapping under the weight of too much ice. It was the sound of a fracture, a clean break born of drunken malice and fragile bone. The silver tray slipped from her left hand, the crystal decanter and glass hitting the obsidian floor with a roar of shattering glass that seemed to echo into infinity. The white-hot agony didn't bloom slowly, it detonated. A surge of neural fire raced from her wrist, up her arm, and directly into the core of her brain, short-circuiting every years-long habit of poise and service. The room went tomb silent. The air seemed to vanish from Maricel's lungs. She didn't scream, she didn't have the breath for it. She simply collapsed onto her knees, her body folding with the tragic grace of a broken bird. She clutched her shattered wrist to her chest, her face turning a translucent shade of ash. Tears, hot and uncontrollable, spilled over her lashes before she could blink them away. "It hurts," she whispered into the sudden, terrifying vacuum of the room. It was the most honest thing she had ever said in the Iron Veil. The ballet academy had taught her to smile through bloody toes and torn ligaments. The casino had taught her to swallow insults like wine. But this pain was too loud to be muffled. She sat on the cold floor amidst the shards of crystal, her amber eyes reflecting a pain so deep it made the men at the surrounding tables look away. Vance stared down at her, his hand still partially extended, the drunken fog in his brain clearing just enough to see the disaster he had authored. But he wasn't the one she was looking at. In the center of the room, Thatcher Rowe had stood up. He didn't move fast, but the air around him began to vibrate with a lethal, focused intent. The investor's grip had broken her bone, but it had also broken the silence of the most dangerous man in Nevada. The high roller floor was no longer a game, it was a crime scene, and the Ice King was coming to claim the evidence. Chapter 3. The silence in the Iron Veil was no longer the hushed reverence of high-stakes gambling. It was the suffocating, heavy stillness that precedes a natural disaster. Julian Vance stood frozen, his face a grotesque mask of half-sobered terror, his hand still hovering in the air where he had just committed the unthinkable. On the floor, amidst the glittering shards of crystal and the spreading pool of $300 scotch, Maricel Cade was curled into herself. She was a broken sculpture of velvet and curls, her breath coming in jagged, shallow hitches as she cradled her wrist. Thatcher Rowe did not run. He did not shout. He moved with a predatory, terrifying grace that made the air in the lounge feel as though it were being sucked out of the room. Every eye in the house followed him. The security team, men hardened by years of street wars and private military contracts, instinctively stepped back, clearing a path as if for a ghost. Thatcher reached the edge of the obsidian table and stopped. He didn't look at Vance. He didn't look at the shattered crystal. He looked down at Maricel. The steel gray of his eyes hadn't changed, but the pressure radiating from him was enough to make the guests at the neighboring tables physically tremble. "Remove him," Thatcher said. His voice wasn't loud. It was a low, vibrational frequency that seemed to hum through the very marrow of the onlookers' bones. It was a command that carried the weight of a death sentence. Instantly, two shadows detached themselves from the walls. They didn't speak to Vance. They grabbed him by the collar and the belt, hoisting him out of the booth as if he were nothing more than a bag of refuse. Vance tried to sputter an apology, a protest about his family's influence. But a gloved hand clamped over his mouth, and he was dragged toward the heavy soundproof doors of the service exit. The room held its collective breath, expecting Thatcher to return to his seat, to order a cleanup and move on with the evening's business. Instead, the most powerful man in the city did something that broke every rule of the Iron Veil. He reached for the buttons of his immaculate charcoal suit jacket. The gesture was slow, deliberate. He slid the jacket off his broad shoulders and draped it over the back of the velvet chair without looking. It was an act of stripping away the armor, of discarding the boss to reveal the man. Then, Thatcher Rowe, the man who demanded the city bow to him, lowered himself. He knelt. The sound of his knee hitting the obsidian tile was as loud as a gunshot in the vacuum of the lounge. The guards blinked, their masks of professional indifference cracking. The pit boss froze with a handful of chips. No one had ever seen Thatcher Rowe lower his height for anyone. "Show me," Thatcher whispered. His voice was different now. The lethal edge was still there, but beneath it was a note of strained, unnatural tenderness. He reached out, his large, calloused hands that had likely broken men in the past, moving with the delicacy of a watchmaker. Maricel looked up, her amber eyes swimming in tears, her face pale and damp. She hesitated, her body still locked in a defensive flinch, but the steady, unwavering gray of his gaze acted like a grounding wire. Slowly she eased her grip on her arm, allowing him to see the damage. The wrist was already beginning to swell, the skin turning a frightening shade of mottled purple where the fracture had occurred. The natural alignment of her hand was gone, tilted at an angle that made Thatcher's jaw tighten so hard the muscle in his cheek pulsed. "It's okay," he said, though his eyes were burning with a cold, contained rage. He didn't touch the injury directly. Instead, he slipped his hand beneath her forearm, providing a stable, warm cradle that prevented the bone from shifting further. Maricel's breath caught as the heat of his skin met hers. In that moment, the pain was still a roar in her ears, but the terror was starting to recede. She looked at this man, this legend of ice and iron, and saw for the first time that his steel-gray eyes weren't cold because he lacked feeling. They were cold because he was keeping a furnace under control. He signaled to a waiter who was standing paralyzed nearby. "The medic. Now. And bring a basin of ice and a silk wrap." Thatcher remained on his knee, ignored the whispers of the room and the cameras watching from the shadows. He held her hand like it was the most valuable asset in his entire empire. He was the king of Iron Veil, and he was kneeling in the spilled scotch and broken glass, because for the first time in 42 years, he had heard a sound he couldn't ignore. the sound of a beautiful thing being broken by a coward. Chapter 4. The in-house medic arrived within minutes, but for the patrons of the Iron Vale, those minutes felt like hours. Thatcher Rowe had not moved from his knee. He remained anchored to the obsidian floor, his large hands still forming a steady, protective cradle beneath Maricel's fractured wrist. The image was jarring. The man who dictated the city's underworld and its political favors, kneeling in a puddle of expensive scotch and shattered crystal, his white shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that spoke of a life lived in the trenches before he reached the throne. Maricel's breathing had slowed, though the occasional hitch in her chest betrayed the waves of agony still pulsing from her arm. She stared at Thatcher, her amber eyes wide and glassy with shock. She had spent years perfecting the art of being invisible, of fading into the background so her father could be the center of her world. Now the most visible man in Ironvale was shielding her from the curious, judgmental stares of the city's elite. The medic, a silver-haired man who had stitched up bullet wounds in back alleys and set the bones of soldiers, knelt on the other side. He worked with a silent, practiced efficiency, his eyes darting to Thatcher for a split second before focusing on Maricel. "It's a clean fracture of the distal radius," the medic murmured, his voice low. "We need to stabilize it immediately and get her to a private clinic for imaging." As the medic applied a rigid splint and began wrapping the wrist in soft, white gauze, Thatcher finally stood. The transition was fluid, his height once again becoming a physical weight in the room. He didn't look at the medic or the guards. He turned his gaze toward the pit boss, a man named Silas, who had been paralyzed by the night's events. "Silas," Thatcher said. The name was a low-frequency vibration that seemed to pull the oxygen out of the air. "Yes, Mr. Rowe," Silas stammered, stepping forward. "The girl's file. Fetch it." Silas didn't ask questions. He hurried to the secure office behind the cashier's cage. The high rollers at the surrounding tables whispered behind their hands, their eyes darting between the broken crystal on the floor and the imposing figure of their host. In Ironvale, information was a currency, and Thatcher Rowe was about to spend a fortune. When Silas returned, he was holding a slim manila folder. Thatcher took it, his steel-gray eyes scanning the pages with clinical speed. He saw the Ballet Academy transcripts, the employment history, and then the section that mattered, the financial liabilities. He saw the itemized bills from Ironvale General Hospital, the mounting interest on a $200,000 debt for a complex spinal reconstruction, and the daily cost of the specialized physical therapy Maricel's father required to keep his muscles from atrophying. The room watched as Thatcher's jaw tightened. He closed the folder and handed it back to Silas, but his eyes never left Maricel, who was being helped to her feet by the medic. She looked small, her velvet uniform stained, and her curls dampened by sweat, but she held her head with the ghost of a dancer's poise even in her broken state. "Clear it," Thatcher commanded. Silas blinked, confused. "Sir? The damages for the wine? The crystal?" "Not the wine." Thatcher's voice dropped an octave, a sound like grinding stone. "The debt, the father's surgery, the hospital liens, every cent owed to Ironvale General and the physical therapy clinics. Pay it in full, now." A collective gasp rippled through the lounge. $200,000 was a drop in the ocean for a man like Thatcher Rowe, but in the world of Ironvale, money was never given for free. It was a tool of leverage, a leash, to wipe out a debt of that magnitude. For a waitress, without a contract, without a demand, without a word spoken in private, was an act of radical mercy that violated every unspoken rule of the city's hierarchy. Maricel froze. She leaned against the medic for support, her good hand flying to her mouth. "Mr. Rowe, I can't." "It's handled," Thatcher said, cutting through her protest. He walked toward her, stopping just inches away. He didn't reach out to touch her again, but the intensity of his presence was more intimate than a physical embrace. "Your father's surgery is no longer your burden. You are finished with the midnight shift." Tears, different from the ones shed in pain, began to stream down Maricel's face. They were tears of a sudden, terrifying freedom. The weight that had been crushing her for years, the calculations of shifts versus survival, the fear of the next bill, the guilt of her father's paralysis. It was gone. It had vanished in a single sentence from a man she had been told to fear. Thatcher turned to his head of security. "Escort her to the clinic. She stays in the private wing. I want a guard at the door, and I want the best orthopedic surgeon in the state on the phone in 10 minutes. As the guards led Maricel toward the elevator, the room remained in a state of stunned disbelief. The Ice King hadn't just punished a bully. He had rewritten the fate of a family. He watched the elevator doors slide shut, his reflection caught in the polished brass. He was a man who had built his empire on the cold logic of power, but tonight, he had responded to the sound of a bone breaking with a gesture that made the entire city weep in the dark. The debt was dust, But the connection, the thin, invisible thread between the mob boss and the dancer, had just been forged in iron. Chapter 5. The private clinic had been a blur of sterile white light, the rhythmic hum of imaging machines, and the clinical efficiency of surgeons who spoke in hushed, respectful tones, usually reserved for royalty. But as the heavy armored SUV crossed the threshold of Thatcher Rowe's private estate, the world changed again. The estate wasn't a fortress of cold stone and steel, as Maricel had imagined. It was a sprawling sanctuary of glass and cedar, nestled against the desert foothills, where the air felt thinner and the silence was absolute. Maricel sat in the back seat, her right arm resting in a heavy, professional cast that smelled of fresh plaster and medicine. The high-dose painkillers had dulled the white-hot roar of the fracture to a heavy, throbbing bass note, but her mind remained sharp, tethered to the reality of her new surroundings by a thread of disbelief. She was no longer a waitress. She was a guest, or a prisoner of debt, she wasn't yet sure, of the most dangerous man in Ironvale. The vehicle stopped at the main entrance, and the door was opened not by a guard, but by Thatcher himself. He had discarded his suit jacket hours ago, and his white silk shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, the sleeves rolled up to reveal the powerful, corded muscles of his forearms. He didn't wait for her to struggle with her cast. He reached in, his movements as fluid and certain as a predator's, and eased her out of the seat. "I can walk, Mr. Rowe," Maricel whispered, her voice sounding small against the vastness of the Nevada night. "I'm sure you can," Thatcher replied, his steel-gray eyes unreadable. "But tonight you don't have to." He didn't carry her like a trophy. He supported her with a grounded strength that made her feel as though the earth itself had stepped in to hold her up. He led her through the house, past walls of local art and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the shimmering lights of the city she had just escaped. They stopped in a wing that smelled of lavender and old books, entering a room where a fire had already been lit in a hearth of riverstone. Thatcher settled her into a deep, velvet armchair near the fire. He moved around the room with a restless, focused energy, adjusting the light, checking the temperature, and finally settling a tray of tea and light broth on the table beside her. It was a domesticity that felt violent in its contrast to the man who had ordered Julian Vance removed with a single word. "Why are you doing this?" Maricel asked, her amber eyes tracking him. "The debt, the clinic, bringing me here. You don't even know me." Thatcher stopped. He stood by the fire, the orange light dancing across the sharp planes of his face, making his gray eyes look like molten silver. He looked at her then, not as a boss, not as a king, but as a man who was looking at something he had accidentally broken. "In Ironvale, everyone wants something," he said, his voice a low, melodic rumble. "They want power, they want money, or they want to be seen. You were the only thing in that room that was real, Maricel. When you said it hurt, you weren't lying to get a settlement or an edge. You were just a human being in pain." He walked over and knelt beside her chair, mirroring the position he had taken on the casino floor. This time, however, there were no witnesses. There were no guards to shock, no guests to intimidate. In the privacy of the hearthlight, the new shadow he cast over her wasn't one of fear, but of an overwhelming, suffocating protection. He reached out, his hand hovering over her cast before resting gently on her shoulder. His touch was warm, heavy with a suppressed emotion that Maricel couldn't quite name. "You spent years being the support for your father's spine," he whispered. "Who was the support for yours?" Maricel felt a lump form in her throat that no painkiller could dissolve. For years, she had been the bridge, the filter, the one who didn't break so that her father could heal. She had forgotten what it felt like to be the one who was allowed to be fragile. Tears, hot and silent, began to track down her cheeks. Thatcher didn't pull away. He didn't offer a platitude. He simply stayed there, a mountain of iron and silk, providing a windbreak for the girl who had been dancing in a storm for far too long. In the quiet of the estate, the Ice King didn't just melt, he became a sanctuary. For the first time since the accident, Maricel didn't have to calculate the cost of her own existence. She was safe, she was seen, and for the first time, she was allowed to let the silence hold her. Chapter 6. The sun began to bleed across the Nevada desert, casting long, amber fingers through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the estate's private gym. It was a space designed for elite performance, filled with the hum of high-end machinery and the scent of eucalyptus. For Maricel, however, it had become a different kind of stage. She stood before a ballet bar that Thatcher had installed specifically for her, her left hand gripping the polished wood while her right arm remained encased in the heavy, white plaster. The physical therapy was a slow, agonizing journey back to herself. Her therapist, a woman with the clinical patience of a saint, guided her through the movements that had once been as natural as breathing. But the fracture had disrupted more than just her bone. It had unsettled the delicate balance of her kinetic chain. Every time she tried to execute a simple ply, her body hesitated, the phantom memory of the crack in the casino echoing in her joints. She was a student of the body, a girl who had studied the way muscles fire and nerves communicate, yet she found herself a stranger in her own skin. She worked until the sweat matted her short curls to her forehead, her amber eyes fixed on her reflection in the mirror, searching for the girl who used to fly. Thatcher was always there. He didn't hover, and he didn't offer empty platitudes. He sat in the corner of the gym, usually with a laptop or a stack of reports, but he was never truly working. He was watching the way she moved. He was learning the vocabulary of her effort, the way her jaw tightened before a difficult stretch, the way her breath caught when the pain spiked. One afternoon, as the therapist left and Maricel slumped against the bar, exhausted, Thatcher stood up. He walked toward her, discarding his phone on a nearby bench. He didn't look like the Ice King today. He wore a simple black t-shirt that showed the tattoos snaking up his arms, stories of a past he never talked about. "You're pushing too hard," he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the quiet room. "I have to," Maricel panted, her face flushed. "If I don't regain the range of motion now, the scar tissue will win. I've seen it happen to dancers. I've seen it happen to my father." Thatcher leaned against the bar beside her, his presence a heavy, grounding force. For the first time, he didn't talk about the casino, or the political favors he was brokering, or the men he had neutralized. He began to talk about the silence. "When I was 20, he started, his eyes fixed on the distant mountains, "I thought power was about how much noise you could make, how many people jumped when you shouted. But then I realized that the real power is in the things you can't hear, like the way a bone heals, or the way a person's rhythm changes when they're afraid." Maricel turned to look at him, her amber eyes softening. This was the softness in private she had begun to sense. The man beneath the charcoal suit who had spent his life observing the world because he didn't know how to be a part of it. He began to tell her about his own injuries, not the ones that came from bar fights, but the ones that came from carrying the weight of a legacy he hadn't asked for. He spoke of his mother, a woman who had loved the opera but lived in a house of stone, and how he had inherited her ability to see the beauty in a broken doll. "My father's surgery," Maricel whispered, shifting the conversation to the hope that now anchored her. "The doctors say he's already showing signs of sensation in his lower limbs. They say it's a miracle." "It's not a miracle," Thatcher replied, finally turning to look at her. His steel-gray eyes were no longer cold. They were filled with a raw, unshielded intensity. "It's what happens when the right resources meet the right will." "You provided the will, Maricel. I just provided the resources." He reached out, his hand hesitating for a fraction of a second, before he gently tucked a stray curl behind her ear. His touch was warm, a contrast to the clinical hands of the therapists. In that moment, the physical therapy wasn't just about her wrist or her father's spine. It was about Thatcher's heart. He was learning to speak a language that didn't involve threats or transactions. He was learning to be human again, one conversation at a time, in the quiet, sun-drenched sanctuary of the gym. As the shadows lengthened, they stayed there by the bar, the dancer and the boss, two people who had both been broken in different ways, finding a new rhythm together. The Ice King was no longer just protecting her, he was letting her see the fire that kept him warm. And Maricel, for the first time since the night in the casino, realized that she wasn't just healing her body, she was healing the man who had saved it. Chapter 7. The waiting room of the Ironvale Surgical Center was a silent testament to Thatcher Rowe's influence. It was a space of muted lighting, plush seating, and air that smelled faintly of sterile linen and expensive coffee. Maricel sat on the edge of a leather chair, her fingers nervously picking at the edge of the sling supporting her cast. The surgery, the complex spinal reconstruction that was supposed to be a miracle, had been underway for 5 hours. Thatcher stood by the panoramic window, his silhouette a sharp, dark line against the encroaching Nevada dusk. He hadn't left her side since they arrived at dawn. He didn't offer empty reassurances. He provided a presence that was as solid as the mountain range in the distance. Every hour, a nurse would appear with a brief update, and every time, Thatcher would listen with a clinical intensity that made Maricel realize this was more than just a charitable act for him. It was a mission. Finally, the lead surgeon, Dr. Aris, stepped through the double doors. He pulled down his mask, his face lined with the exhaustion of a successful battle. "He's through, Maricel," the doctor said, a small smile breaking through his fatigue. "The decompression was successful, and we've stabilized the L3 and L4 vertebrae. He's in recovery now. It will be a long road, but the neurological response is already better than we anticipated." The relief hit Maricel with the force of a physical blow. She let out a breath she felt she had been holding since the day of the accident, her eyes filling with tears of pure, unadulterated hope. She looked at Thatcher, who simply nodded once, a brief flash of something, perhaps atonement, flickering in his gray eyes, before he turned to coordinate the post-operative security. It was 3 hours later when they were finally allowed into the recovery suite. The room was filled with the rhythmic beep of monitors and the soft hiss of oxygen. Elias Cade lay in the bed, looking smaller and more fragile than Maricel remembered, but his color was returning. As the anesthesia began to lift, his eyelids fluttered, and his gaze found his daughter. "Maricel," he croaked, his voice a ghost of the booming bass that used to fill their home. "I'm here, Dad," she whispered, taking his hand with her left, her amber eyes shimmering. "The surgery, it's done. You're going to walk again." Elias smiled weakly, but his eyes drifted past her, landing on the tall, imposing figure standing in the shadows of the doorway. Thatcher had remained back, giving them their moment, but his presence was impossible to ignore. Elias frowned, his brow furrowing as he squinted at the man in the charcoal suit. "That man," Elias whispered, his voice gaining a sudden, sharp clarity. "Who is he?" "That's Thatcher Rowe, Dad," Maricel said, her voice filled with a warmth she didn't try to hide. "He's the one who made this possible. He cleared the debt. He brought the surgeons." The name seemed to hang in the sterile air like a frost. Elias's hand tightened in Maricel's. His eyes, usually so gentle, turned hard and piercing as they locked onto Thatcher's. The monitor beside the bed began to beep faster, reflecting the sudden spike in his heart rate. "Rowe," Elias repeated, the word sounding like a curse. "Thatcher Rowe." Thatcher stepped forward into the light, his face a mask of iron, though his hands were clenched at his sides. He didn't flinch from Elias's gaze. He stood there, vulnerable in a way he never allowed himself to be in the casino, waiting for the blow he knew was coming. "I know that name," Elias said, his voice trembling with a mixture of shock and a decades-old pain. "I know that face. 20 years ago, a black sedan on the interstate. The driver who didn't stop. The driver who left us for dead in the rain." Maricel looked from her father to Thatcher, the blood draining from her face. The new hierarchy of her life suddenly felt like it was built on a foundation of shifting sand. She saw the way Thatcher's jaw worked, the way his steel-gray eyes filled with a dark, suffocating guilt that finally explained the kneeling, the debt, and the sanctuary. It was his father, Elias whispered, his gaze never leaving Thatcher. He had the same eyes, the same cold, unyielding eyes. The silence that followed was more violent than the crash that had shattered Maricel's wrist. In the quiet of the recovery room, the miracle of the surgery was eclipsed by the ghost of the accident. The Ice King hadn't just saved her father. He was the son of the man who had broken him. And as Maricel looked at the man she had begun to trust, she realized that the language of success they had been learning was actually a language of penance. The truth had finally entered the room, and it was a language that threatened to break them both. Chapter 8. The air in the recovery suite felt as though it had been replaced by liquid lead. The rhythmic, artificial chirping of the heart monitor was the only sound in the room, ticking like a countdown to a detonation. Maricel felt the world tilting on its axis, the face of the man she had begun to admire blurring into the face of a monster's son. She looked at Thatcher, expecting him to deny it, expecting him to scoff at the delusions of a man coming out of heavy anesthesia. But Thatcher Rowe didn't move. He stood in the shadows of the doorway, his silhouette rigid, his gaze fixed on Elias Cade with a look of profound, devastating recognition. "It wasn't just the eyes," Elias rasped, his hand trembling as it clutched Maricel's. "It was the way he looked at us through the glass before he sped away. Like we were roadkill, like we were an inconvenience to his evening." He turned his amber eyes, so like Maricel's, to his daughter. The black sedan, the vanity plate that read, Row 1. "I never forgot it, Maricel. I spent 20 years seeing that plate every time I closed my eyes in a wheelchair." Maricel turned slowly toward Thatcher. The silence grew, until it was a roar in her ears. "Tell him he's wrong," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Thatcher, tell him it's a mistake." Thatcher finally stepped forward, moving into the pool of clinical LED light. The Ice King was gone. In his place was a man stripped of his titles, his suits, and his secrets. He looked at Maricel, and for the first time, his steel-gray eyes were wet. "He isn't wrong," Thatcher said. His voice was a hollowed-out version of itself, a baritone vibration that seemed to carry the weight of 2 decades of silence. He didn't look at Elias yet. He looked only at Maricel. "I was 22 years old. I was in the passenger seat. My father was driving us home from a political gala in Reno. He was drunk, not the stumbling kind, but the arrogant kind. The kind that thinks the road belongs to him by divine right." Thatcher took a jagged breath, his chest heaving under the silk of his shirt. "When we clipped your car, it felt like nothing more than a bump in the road to him. I told him to stop. I shouted at him to pull over. I saw the car spin. I saw it roll into the ditch. He finally turned his gaze to the man in the hospital bed. My father looked at me and said, "A road does not involve himself in the misfortunes of the common." He locked the doors. He put his foot on the gas. And I was a coward. I sat there and watched the red taillights of our car fade away from the wreckage of yours. The confession was a physical blow. Maricel felt a cold numbness spreading from her chest to her fingertips, rivaling the dull ache of her fractured wrist. The money, the cleared debt, the private surgeons. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was a payoff. It was blood money, disguised as a miracle. "Is that why you cleared the debt?" Maricel's voice was flat, the warmth of the previous days replaced by a clinical chill. "Is that why you knelt on that floor? Because you were looking at the girl whose life your family stole?" "I've looked for you for 10 years, Thatcher whispered, ignoring the tears that finally tracked down his sharp cheekbones. "The moment I took over the family assets, I hired investigators. I wanted to find the people in that ditch. But my father had wiped the police reports. He'd buried the files. I didn't know your names until you walked into my casino and Julian Vance broke your wrist. The moment I saw your file, the accident date, the location, the nature of your father's injury, I knew. I knew the universe had finally brought me the bill." Elias let out a choked sound of rage and grief, his body straining against the hospital bed. "You think a check makes it right? You think a fancy room and a new spine erases 20 years of my daughter scrubbing floors to feed a man who can't walk? Get out." Thatcher didn't move to defend himself. He stood there, accepting the judgment, as if it were the only thing that could finally set him free. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said, his voice steadying into a somber vow. "I didn't do this to be forgiven. I did it because it was the only way I could live with the ghost in the passenger seat." He looked at Maricel one last time, a look of such profound hopeless love and regret that it made her heart skip a beat even through her anger. "The guards will stay until he is discharged. The house in the foothills is yours. I've already transferred the deed to your name. You never have to see me again, Maricel. But you will never be hungry, and he will never be still again." As Thatcher turned and walked out of the room, his footsteps heavy on the sterile linoleum, the ghost of the crash seemed to follow him like a shadow. Maricel sat in the silence, clutching her father's hand, the miracle of the surgery now tasting like ash. The man who had saved her world was the same man who had destroyed it, and as the monitor continued its steady, indifferent beep, she realized that some fractures, no matter how much gold you poured into them, would never truly heal. Chapter 9. The air in the private wing of the estate felt as though it had been thinned by a vacuum. Maricel stood in the center of the bedroom Thatcher had prepared for her, a room filled with the scent of lavender and the soft, insulting glow of a fire she hadn't asked for. Her right arm, heavy in its medical cast, felt like a leaden weight, a physical anchor connecting her to the man she now realized was the architect of her family's ruin. Every luxury in the room, the Egyptian cotton sheets, the hand-carved cedar furniture, the view of the Nevada stars, now felt like a bribe, a gilded cage built with the interest on 20 years of her father's suffering. She didn't pack a suitcase. She didn't have one. She simply pulled on her old, worn hoodie over her velvet uniform, the fabric tight against the bulky plaster. Her amber eyes, usually so warm and filled with a dancer's discipline, were now jagged shards of glass. She moved toward the door, her footsteps silent on the thick Persian rugs. She didn't care about the deed to the house in the foothills or the security details Thatcher had promised. To stay here was to breathe in the oxygen of a lie. She reached the grand foyer, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The house was a temple of silence, but she knew Thatcher was there. He was always there, a shadow that didn't need light to exist. As she reached for the heavy iron handle of the front door, his voice drifted from the darkness of the library, low and resonant, vibrating through the soles of her feet. "The car is waiting if you truly wish to go, Maricel, but the painkillers haven't fully cleared your system. You aren't fit to drive, let alone walk to the gates." Maricel froze, her hand gripping the cold metal. She turned, her curls damp with the sweat of exertion. Thatcher stood in the doorway of the library, silhouetted by the dying embers of another fire. He had changed into a dark sweater, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his posture lacking the predatory sharpness it usually held. He looked like a man standing at his own execution. "I don't want your car." Maricel spat, the words tasting like copper in her mouth. "I don't want your house. I don't want anything that was bought with the blood you left in that ditch." Thatcher didn't move toward her. He stayed in the shadows, his steel-gray eyes fixed on her with a desperate, hollowed-out intensity. "I know," he whispered, "but your father needs the post-operative care that only this estate's medical wing can provide. If you leave him behind, or you take him back to a walk-up apartment where the elevators don't work." "You're a monster," she whispered, the tears finally breaking past her guard. "You knew who I was the second I fell. You didn't help me because you were kind. You helped me because you were scared. You saw the bill coming due and you tried to pay it off with a silk wrap and a check. I was never scared of the bill, Maricel, Thatcher said, his voice dropping into that dangerous, baritone register. I was scared of the look in your eyes if you ever found out. And I was right to be. He took a single step into the light, his face pale. Go. If staying here hurts more than the fracture, then go. I will have the medical staff move to your apartment. I will have a lift installed. I will vanish. But don't think for a second that my silence 20 years ago was because I didn't care. I was a child who was broken by a giant, and I've spent every day since trying to grow tall enough to tear his legacy down. Maricel looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the ghost of the crash reflected in the way he stood. He was haunted, a man who had built an empire just to have a high enough vantage point to search for the people he'd lost. But the connection to her father's pain was too fresh, a jagged wound that refused to close. You can't fix a life with a signature, Thatcher, she said, her voice trembling but certain. She pulled the door open, the desert wind rushing in to chill the sweat on her skin. You think you're different from your father because you stayed to watch the healing. But you're exactly like him. You still think you're the one who gets to decide how the story ends. She stepped out into the night, the gravel crunching under her sneakers. She didn't look back at the glass and cedar sanctuary. She walked toward the gates, her broken arm clutched to her chest, her body remembering the discipline of the ballet, head high, shoulders back, even when the stage is falling apart. Behind her, Thatcher Rowe stood in the doorway, a king without a kingdom, watching the only thing that ever made him feel human disappear into the dark. The rejection was absolute, and for the first time in his life, the most powerful man in Ironvale realized that there were some debts that simply couldn't be settled. Chapter 10. The gravel road leading away from Thatcher's estate was a dark, lonely ribbon cutting through the Nevada scrub, and as Maricel walked, the adrenaline that had fueled her departure began to ebb, replaced by the cold, biting reality of the world she had tried to reclaim. She hadn't gone more than a mile before the first flicker of the vultures appeared. It started as a notification on her phone, a social media tag from an anonymous account, then another, then a flood. Julian Vance's family was not merely wealthy, they were a political dynasty with deep roots in Ironvale's infrastructure, and they had spent the last 48 hours sharpening their knives. By the time Maricel reached the main road, the smear campaign had already reached a fever pitch. A grainy, edited video of her collapse in the casino had been leaked, but the audio had been stripped and replaced with a mocking soundtrack. The narrative was being rewritten in real time. Maricel wasn't a victim of an assault. She was a scam artist, a failed dancer, who had intentionally tripped to shake down a prominent investor for a settlement. The vultures didn't just stop at her reputation. By sunrise, a local tabloid, funded by a shell company linked to the Vance family, published an investigation into her father's accident. They didn't mention the black sedan or the Rowe name. Instead, they hinted at Elias Cade's, quote, history of reckless behavior, suggesting the crash 20 years ago was his own fault, a desperate attempt at an insurance fraud that had finally caught up to him. Maricel sat on a bus bench at the edge of the city, her fractured wrist throbbing in time with the scrolling headlines. She felt the eyes of the commuters on her, their gazes lingering a second too long on her cast, then darting back to their phones. She was no longer the invisible waitress. She was the most hated woman in Ironvale. The Vance family was using their influence to ensure that no restaurant would ever hire her again, no physical therapy clinic would accept her father, and no lawyer would dare take her case. The pressure was surgical. They were squeezing her until she had nothing left but the debt she thought had been cleared. They wanted her to retract her statement against Julian, to sign a non-disclosure agreement that would erase his crime and her father's truth forever. In the shadows of the city's skyscrapers, the Vance family's fixers moved with clinical precision. They visited the hospital where Elias was recovering, whispering to the administration about liability issues and unverified funding. They were making the world too small for Maricel to breathe in. Every time she closed her eyes, she could hear the clatter of wings, the sound of a dynasty circling a wounded animal, waiting for her to crawl back to the only man who could stop them. But Maricel Cade was a ballerina, and she knew how to hold a position even when the stage was burning. She looked at her phone, at the vitriol pouring in from strangers, and then at the cast on her arm. The vultures thought she was fragile because she had broken, but they didn't understand that a bone, once healed, is often stronger at the point of the fracture. She wasn't going back to Thatcher, and she wasn't going to let the Vance family bury the truth. The smear campaign was a storm, but as she stood up from the bench, her amber eyes hardening into something lethal, she realized that a storm was exactly what was needed to wash the grime off Ironvale. The vultures were circling, but they had forgotten one thing. She had spent her life learning how to move in the dark, and she was done being invisible. Chapter 11. The basement apartment she had returned to felt like a tomb of her former life, smelling of damp concrete, and the faded scent of her father's peppermint tea. Maricel sat at the small kitchen table, her cast resting heavily on the cracked formica, as the blue light of her laptop screen illuminated the dark. The Vance family's smear campaign had successfully turned her into a pariah, but they had underestimated one thing. A ballerina knows how to look for the slight tremor in a partner's grip, the infinitesimal slip that signals a fall. She began digging into the digital footprint Julian Vance had left behind. While the public was distracted by the doctored videos of her fall, Maricel was looking at the numbers. Julian wasn't just a drunken investor. He was a middleman for a series of high-stakes gambling syndicates that interfaced with Thatcher's casinos. Using the analytical skills she had sharpened while studying physical therapy, tracing the source of a pain back to its hidden origin, she began to trace the flow of capital. She found it in the metadata of an old service log she had kept on her phone to track her tips. Months ago, Julian had left a physical ledger at his table, a small, leather-bound book that Maricel had tucked into the lost and found, but not before she had snapped photos of several pages, thinking they were just strange, encrypted grocery lists. Now, with the context of Thatcher's empire in her mind, those lists transformed into a stolen ledger. The photos revealed a systematic embezzlement scheme. Julian Vance hadn't been losing his money at the baccarat tables. He had been skimming from Thatcher's private high-roller accounts, using a series of ghost bets to move funds into his family's political war chests. He was a parasite feeding on the very man who controlled the city. The amounts were staggering. Millions of dollars diverted through the Iron Vale's own internal software, hidden under the guise of house losses. The realization made the air in the cramped apartment feel electric. Julian Vance hadn't grabbed her wrist just because he was drunk. He had panicked when she approached the table, fearing she had seen the digital tablet he was using to authorize a fraudulent transfer. He hadn't just broken her bone, he had been trying to silence a witness to a theft that could bring down his entire dynasty. Maricel leaned back, her amber eyes reflecting the columns of numbers. She had the proof that would not only clear her name, but would give Thatcher the ammunition to destroy the Vance family forever. But as she looked at the stolen ledger, she felt the weight of a different choice. To give this to Thatcher was to step back into his world, to re-enter the shadow of the man whose family had shattered hers. Her wrist throbbed, a sharp reminder of the cost of being near him. Yet the vultures were still circling, and her father was still a target. She realized that in Iron Vale, the truth wasn't a shield, it was a weapon. She didn't need Thatcher to protect her. She needed him to be the hand that swung the blade she had just forged. She picked up her phone, her fingers trembling, as she dialed the number she had vowed to delete. The line didn't even ring twice before Thatcher's low, baritone voice answered, sounding as though he had been waiting in the dark for her call. Maricel? I found the reason Julian Vance broke my arm, she said, her voice a steady, cold frequency that matched the hum of the city outside. It wasn't about the wine, Thatcher. It was about the millions he's been stealing from you. I have the ledger. And if you want it, you're gonna have to let me be the one to end him. The silence on the other end was absolute, a vacuum where the Ice King's rage and respect met. In that moment, the waitress was gone, and the architect of her own justice had taken her place. The stolen ledger was no longer just data. It was the key to a kingdom, and Maricel Cade was finally ready to turn it. Chapter 12. The ride into the heart of the city was silent, but it wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of the estate. It was a shared frequency of anticipation. Thatcher drove himself, his large hands steady on the wheel, while Maricel sat in the passenger seat, the stolen ledger, a physical weight in her lap. She watched the neon skyline of Iron Vale approach, a glittering, artificial oasis in the middle of the Nevada dust, and wondered how much of this glass and steel was built on the wreckage of families like hers. Thatcher didn't head toward the casino. Instead, he steered the SUV toward the Foundry District, an area that had once been a graveyard of abandoned warehouses and rusted machinery. As they slowed, Maricel saw a sprawling complex of modern architecture, curving glass walls, lush rooftop gardens, and a sign that glowed with a soft, steady light, the Cade Neurological Center. Maricel's breath hitched. You named it after us. I didn't name it, Thatcher said, his voice a low, baritone rumble that resonated in the small cabin. I funded it. I spent the last 10 years buying up every derelict lot in this district to build a network of trauma centers, low-income housing and vocational schools. This is the architect of Iron Vale's real work. The casino is just the engine that pays for the atonement. He parked the car and walked her through the grounds. He showed her the physical therapy wings, where the equipment was state-of-the-art, the research labs dedicated to spinal regeneration, and the community halls where the children of the city's forgotten workers were taught to code and create. Every building, every garden, every high-tech lab was a silent apology for a black sedan that hadn't stopped in the rain 20 years ago. My father built monuments to his ego, Thatcher whispered, standing in the center of a courtyard where a fountain mimicked the sound of a mountain stream. He liked to see his name in gold. I wanted to build things that would outlast the Roe name. I wanted to create a city that wouldn't let a girl like you fall through the cracks. Maricel looked at him, the orange glow of the streetlights reflecting in her amber eyes. She saw the exhaustion behind his steel-gray gaze, the years of silent labor he had put into this secret city. He wasn't just a mob boss. He was a man trying to reverse engineer a tragedy. He had used his power to create a safety net for the very people his father had treated as roadkill. The Vance family thinks they're the pillars of this city, Thatcher continued, his voice hardening as he looked back toward the high-rises. But they're just parasites living in the eaves. They don't realize that I didn't just build these clinics for the sick. I built them as a fortress. And now, with the ledger you found, we have the keys to tear their towers down. Maricel felt the shift in her own heart. The anger was still there, a jagged, cold reminder of her father's 20 years in a chair, but it was being tempered by the reality of the work before her. Thatcher hadn't just given her money, he had given her a mirror, showing her that power could be used for more than just conquest. I spent my life trying to be invisible so I wouldn't get hurt, Maricel said, her hand tightening on the ledger. But you built a city where people are allowed to be seen. If we use this proof, the vultures won't just be stopped, they'll be erased. Thatcher turned to her, a small, grim smile touching his lips. It was the first time she had seen him look truly alive. Then let's stop being architects of silence, Maricel. Let's be the ones who finally speak the truth loud enough to break the glass. As they stood in the heart of the Foundry District, surrounded by the evidence of Thatcher's secret penance, the partnership was no longer a matter of debt or guilt. It was a matter of design. The architect and the dancer were ready to move in sync, and for the first time in 20 years, the city of Ironvale was about to hear a rhythm it couldn't ignore. Chapter 13. The Winter Solstice Gala was the crowning jewel of the Ironvale social calendar, a night where the city's corruption was draped in white silk and expensive orchids. Held in the grand ballroom of the Sapphire Heights Hotel, it was a neutral ground, at least on the surface. But as Maricel Cade stepped out of the black sedan, she felt the predatory hum of the city's elite. She was dressed in a gown of midnight blue that masked the lightweight brace on her wrist, her curls pinned back with a precision that mirrored the steel in her gaze. She wasn't here to serve. She was here to dismantle. Beside her, Thatcher Rowe was a shadow in a tuxedo, his presence a silent warning to the photographers lining the red carpet. He didn't touch her, but his proximity was a physical weight, a barrier between her and the whispers of the crowd. They both knew the Vance family had set a trap. Julian Vance's father, Senator Sterling Vance, stood at the center of the ballroom, surrounded by cameras and city officials, his smile as brittle as the ice sculptures decorating the buffet. As Maricel and Thatcher entered, the room didn't just go quiet, it became a vacuum. The vultures were no longer circling from a distance. They were in the room. The smear campaign had reached its apex, and the Vance family intended to use this public stage to finalize Maricel's destruction. Halfway through the evening, the music cut. The rhythmic clink of crystals ceased. Senator Vance stepped onto the dais, flanked by the chief of police. He didn't look at Thatcher. He looked directly at Maricel. Ladies and gentlemen, Vance's voice projected with the practiced resonance of a man who owned the airwaves. Ironvale is a city built on integrity, and yet we have been infiltrated by those who seek to use our benevolence as a weapon. A certain victim has accused my son of a heinous crime to cover her own history of theft and corporate espionage. Tonight we put an end to the lies. He signaled to the doors. 4 officers moved toward Maricel, their hands on their zip ties. The charge was ready. Grand larceny and the theft of proprietary data from the Ironvale casino. They intended to arrest her in front of every power player in the state, ensuring that even if the charges didn't stick, her life would be permanently stained. Maricel didn't flinch. She felt the surge of cortisol, the fight-or-flight response, but she leaned into the fight. She remembered the discipline of the bar, the way a dancer holds their center even when the floor is moving. She reached into her clutch and pulled out a small encrypted drive, the digital manifestation of the stolen ledger. Thatcher stepped forward, his voice a low, baritone rumble that cut through the senator's theatrics. The only theft occurring in this room, Senator, is the millions your son has been siphoning from my casinos to fund your re-election. The room gasped, but Vance laughed, a dry, rattling sound. A desperate lie from a mob boss protecting a waitress. Arrest her. The officers closed in, but Maricel didn't move. She looked Vance in the eye, her amber gaze reflecting the cold light of the chandeliers. She wasn't the broken girl in the casino anymore. She was the one holding the fuse. I didn't just find the ledger, Senator, she said, her voice clear and carrying to every corner of the ballroom. I found the bank accounts in the Cayman Islands. I found the emails where you discussed the accident 20 years ago as a template for how to handle minor inconveniences. You didn't just try to arrest me tonight. You tried to arrest the only person who has the receipts for your family's soul. The gala trap had been sprung, but the Vance family had miscalculated the prey. They had expected a waitress who would crumble under the weight of the law. Instead, they found a woman who had been forged in the fire of their own making. As Thatcher raised his hand, signaling the tech team he had planted in the ballroom's AV booth, the giant screens behind the senator flickered to life, displaying the first page of the embezzlement records. The trap had turned. The vultures were no longer circling. They were being caught in the light. And in the center of the chaos, Maricel Cade stood perfectly still, the only person in the room who truly knew how to dance through a storm. Chapter 14. The silence that followed the projection of the ledger was a heavy, suffocating blanket. On the giant screens, the cold mathematics of the Vance family's betrayal scrolled upward, a waterfall of incriminating data that turned the Sapphire Heights ballroom into a courtroom. Senator Sterling Vance stood on the dais, his face losing its practiced color, looking like a man watching his own execution in high definition. The police officers who had been moments away from cuffing Maricel hesitated, their hands hovering near their belts, their eyes shifting toward the chief of police. Thatcher Rowe stepped into the center of the floor. He didn't look like a man in a fight. He looked like a landlord checking on a property. He reached into the breast pocket of his tuxedo and pulled out a single gold-embossed document. He didn't hand it to the officers. He held it up so the senator could see the seal. "You speak of the law, Sterling, as if it is something you authored," Thatcher said, his voice a baritone rumble that vibrated through the marble floorboards. "But the law in Ironvale doesn't belong to the man with the most votes. It belongs to the man who holds the titles. 20 minutes ago, the board of the Sapphire Heights Hotel finalized a sale. I didn't just buy the ballroom. I bought the building. And 10 minutes before that, I acquired the primary debt of the Vance family's political action committee." The senator's eyes bulged. "You can't. That's not how this works." "It is exactly how it works," Thatcher countered, taking a slow, deliberate step toward the dais. "I own the land you're standing on. I own the legacy you've spent 40 years building. And as of this moment, I own the very department you're trying to use as your personal guard." He looked at the chief of police, a man whose pension was managed by a firm Thatcher had acquired 3 years prior. "Chief, do you still wish to execute an arrest based on the fabrications of a man who is currently $3 million overdrawn on a line of credit I now control?" The chief cleared his throat, the sound dry and nervous. He looked at the screens, then at the senator, and finally at the man who held the city's heartbeat in his hands. He signaled his men to stand down. Maricel watched the shift from the center of the room. She saw the vultures in the audience, the socialites and the power brokers, begin to physically lean away from the Vances. The social contagion of defeat was visible. The political dynasty was being dismantled not by a bullet, but by a purchase. Thatcher had used his wealth not just to protect her, but to terraform the environment around her, so that danger could no longer grow. "Your father's accident was a tragedy of convenience for your family," Thatcher said, his gaze finally settling on the senator's son Julian, who was cowering near the bar. "You thought you could break a woman's wrist and treat her like an insurance liability, because you believed you were the architect of this city. But I have spent 20 years ensuring that when the day came, I wouldn't just be a witness. I would be the owner." Thatcher turned to Maricel. The ice in his gray eyes softened for a fraction of a second, a private signal in a public space. He wasn't just showing her his power, he was showing her that he had used that power to build a fortress where her father would never be roadkill again. "The Vance legacy is over," Thatcher announced to the room, his voice carrying the finality of a gavel. "Every asset, every favor, and every lie is now my property. And I am choosing to liquidate it all." As the senator was escorted out, not as a dignitary but as a debtor, the room remained in a state of stunned paralysis. Thatcher Rowe hadn't just saved the waitress, he had bought the world that tried to break her. And as Maricel stood beside him, her midnight blue gown catching the light of the chandeliers, she realized that the iron doll of the old stories wasn't just a victim who survived. She was the woman who stood next to the man who owned the law, the land, and the legacy, finally ready to write a new history for them both. Chapter 15. The stage of the Ironvale Grand Theater was a vast, hollow lung of velvet and dust, its rows of empty seats stretching back into the gloom like a sleeping audience of ghosts. It had been years since Maricel had stood in the center of a spotlight, years since she had felt the biting chill of the resin on her slippers and the electric hum of a silent house. Tonight there were no tickets sold, no critics waiting with sharpened pens, and no cameras. There was only one man sitting in the center of the fifth row, his presence a heavy, grounding anchor in the darkness. Maricel stood in the wings, her heart performing a frantic allegro against her ribs, her right wrist, once a map of fractures and purple swelling, was now sleek and strong, the bone knit back together by the best surgeons money could buy, and a discipline that refused to break. She flexed it, feeling the smooth glide of the tendons, the neurological pathways re-established, and firing with perfect clarity. The ballet of shadows was about to begin, not as a performance of vanity, but as a final exorcism of the pain that had brought them together. The music began, a haunting, solitary cello that seemed to rise from the floorboards. Maricel stepped into the light. She was dressed in a costume of tattered white silk that caught the blue hues of the spots, making her look like a spirit caught between worlds. She began to move, her body reclaiming the geometry of the stage. Every plie was a defiance of the gravity that had once grounded her father. Every grand jeté was a flight away from the basement apartment and the trays of crystal flutes. As she danced, she wasn't just performing for Thatcher. She was telling him the story of the crash, the recovery, and the rebirth. She used the stage to show him the weight she had carried, the way her muscles remembered the tension of the midnight shift, and then, with a sharp, percussive turn, she showed him the moment she had let it go. From his seat, Thatcher Rowe watched with a gaze that was no longer steel gray, but a soft, burning silver. He saw the girl he had found broken on an obsidian floor transform into a creature of pure, unyielding light. He saw the wrist he had cradled in the spilled scotch move, with a strength that was terrifying in its beauty. To him, this wasn't just dance, it was a revelation. He was watching the architect of his own redemption, the woman who had taken his penance and turned it into art. Maricel spun faster, the world blurring into a kaleidoscope of blue and white. She felt the scars on her father's spine, the guilt in Thatcher's eyes, and the greed of the vultures all dissolving into the movement. She was no longer the waitress. She was the dancer who had survived the shadows. As the final note of the cello faded into the rafters, she sank into a deep, graceful reverence, her head bowed, her breath coming in shallow, triumphant hitches. The silence that followed was absolute, until Thatcher stood. He didn't clap. The sound would have been too small for the moment. He walked down the center aisle and stepped onto the stage, his silhouette merging with hers in the fading light. He reached out, taking her healed hand in his thumb tracing the invisible line where the fracture had been. "You aren't dancing in the shadows anymore, Maricel," he whispered, his voice a baritone rumble that filled the empty theater. "We aren't," she corrected him, looking up into his eyes. In the privacy of the Grand Theater, the ballet of shadows had ended, and the light had finally taken hold. The wrist was healed, the debt was gone, and the girl who had once sobbed that she was broken was now the only one in Ironvale who knew how to fly. They stood together, in the center of the stage, two people who had found a new rhythm in the wreckage, ready to face the city not as a boss and a victim, but as a masterpiece they had built together. Chapter 16. 6 months later, the high desert sun of Nevada didn't feel like a scorching weight, but like a spotlight. The Foundry District had been completely transformed, no longer a cluster of rusted skeletons, but the beating heart of the Cade Foundation for Spinal Rehabilitation. Maricel stood on the glass-walled balcony of her office, looking down at the courtyard, where patients moved through the gardens. Some were walking with the aid of high-tech exoskeletons, others were practicing their gait on specialized surfaces, but all of them were being seen. Maricel had traded her black velvet uniform for a tailored suit of cream silk, though her movements still carried the ghost of the ballet, a fluidity that no amount of trauma could truly erase. Her right wrist was completely healed, the surgical scar a thin silvery line that she no longer felt the need to hide. It was a badge of the night the Ice King had knelt, a reminder that, from a fracture, a new kind of strength could grow. Inside the clinic, her father, Elias, was no longer a man confined to the sidelines of his own life. He was the Foundation's lead advocate, his recovery a living testament to the work they did. He didn't just walk. He moved with a purpose that defied the 20 years of stillness the Vance family had imposed upon him. The ghost of the crash had finally been laid to rest, not through vengeance, but through the hundreds of lives being rebuilt within these walls. The door to her office opened, and she didn't need to turn to know who it was. The air in the room didn't drop 10 degrees anymore. Instead, it felt grounded, steady. Thatcher Rowe stepped onto the balcony, his charcoal suit immaculate, but his steel-gray eyes held a warmth that was now his permanent state when they were alone. He was no longer the man who commanded from a throne of obsidian. He was the man who protected the sanctuary they had built together. The gala invitation arrived, Thatcher said, his voice a baritone rumble that no longer carried the edge of a threat. "The new city council wants you to speak about the Foundation's expansion." Maricel turned, leaning against the glass railing. "And what does the architect of Ironvale think?" Thatcher walked toward her, stopping close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him. He reached out, taking her hand, the one that had once been shattered, and brought it to his lips. The gesture was a silent vow, a promise renewed every day since the night at the Sapphire Heights. He wasn't her boss, and he wasn't her savior. He was her partner in a city that they had collectively reclaimed. "I think the architect is retired," Thatcher whispered against her skin. "I'm just a man who follows the lead of the dancer now." He was no longer the Ice King, frozen in a penance he couldn't name. He was the protector of a legacy that actually mattered. The casino still ran, the wheels still spun, and the money still flowed. But it was all channeled into the light of the Foundry District. They had taken the cracks in their lives and filled them with gold, creating something more beautiful for having been broken. As the sun dipped below the Sierra Nevada mountains, casting a long, protective shadow over the clinic, Maricel leaned her head against Thatcher's shoulder. The silence between them was full, a shared understanding of the cost of their journey and the value of the peace they had earned. In the heart of Ironvale, the waitress and the boss had found a rhythm that the rest of the world couldn't touch. They had walked through the fire, survived the vulturing, and come out not just whole, but sovereign. The vow was silent, but as they stood together overlooking the city, it was the loudest thing in Nevada. In the neon-drenched underworld of Ironvale City, Maricel Cade is a woman living on the edge. A former prima ballerina whose dreams were shattered by a tragic accident, she now works grueling double shifts as a waitress in an elite underground casino to pay for her father's life-saving spinal surgery. But one night, the unthinkable happens. A powerful investor's assault leaves Maricel with a fractured bone and a soul-crushing realization of her own fragility. When she gasps the words, "It hurts," she doesn't realize she's caught the attention of the Ice King himself, Thatcher Rowe, the city's most feared Mafia boss. What follows is a breathtaking journey of redemption, power, and unexpected tenderness. From the moment Thatcher kneels in the shards of broken glass, to the shocking revelation of a 20-year-old secret that links their families together, this is more than a romance, it's a battle for justice. Watch as a broken waitress and a cold-hearted titan dismantle a corrupt political dynasty to build a legacy of healing. It is a story that proves the strongest people aren't those who never break, but those who find the courage to stand back up and fly. Did Maricel's journey from the casino floor to the head of a medical empire touch your heart? If you were moved by Thatcher's transformation from a ruthless boss to a devoted protector, make sure to smash that like button right now. It helps us bring more powerful stories like this to life. We want to hear from our global community. Comment below and let us know where in the world you are watching from. Do you have a friend who loves a dramatic, high-stakes romance? Hit the share button and send this video to them. And finally, if you want to stay on the edge of your seat with our next emotional roller coaster, don't forget to subscribe and turn on that notification bell. You won't want to miss what we have coming next.